right, again, welcome everyone. Neil will be joining us shortly, so I will review what Neil usually walks us through. So please remember that the audience agreements for courageous conversation, we will stay engaged, expect to experience discomfort, speak your truth, and expect and accept a lack of closure. We're not going to solve everything this evening. Just a couple reminders, this conversation will be recorded and available on YWCA Rock County's YouTube channel. Parts of the evening may be recorded by other media outlets if they pop in. Just wanted to make you aware of that. And YWCA Rock County and Diversity Action Team of Rock County are both nonpartisan, while Community Action Inc. of Rock and Walworth County is apolitical. At the end of the program, partner organizations will be able to provide announcements. All other participants are welcome to give announcements once we enter the parking lot portion, which begins at 7 p.m. All right. So this evening we have some wonderful videos for you that will frame our discussion about Juneteenth. We will start with a brief overview and a history of Juneteenth. I'll put the link in the chat, but the video is called Juneteenth, 1865 to 2021. We're going to watch 3 portions of the video. The full form is 49 minutes. I will put that in the chat in case you want to go back and see the portions that we won't cover this evening. The next video will be rare audio of enslaved people and connecting the history to the present with respect to Juneteenth. And then we'll go into why we believe all Americans should celebrate and honor Juneteenth. So with that being said, we will start with our first video.
Number 3, Juneteenth order.
The people of Texas are informed that, in accordance with a proclamation from the Executive of the United States, all slaves are free. This involves an absolute equality of personal rights and rights of property between former masters and slaves. And the connection heretofore existing between them becomes that between an employer and hired labor.
You can imagine the burden lifted from these people, the men, the women, the children that knew that they were chattel property, and now understanding that they were free. But the question that was lingering was, what did freedom look like?
The slaves built this country.
They had a sense of who they were. They very quickly built a sense of community.
To what degree have we actually achieved the absolute freedom that Juneteenth promised?
Ignoring these painful histories doesn't mean that they don't still influence us.
We stand on the shoulders of those that came before us, and we need to honor their memory by telling their story.
Juneteenth, 1865 to 2021.
Galveston, Texas, place known for tourism and quick getaways. But it's the history which happened here that impacts us all today.
African slaves were brought here on ships in the 1800s. But even after the slave trade ended, slavery here did not.
It was 1865, June 19th, now known as Juneteenth, when Union soldiers arrived and told slaves they were free.
It came 2 years after President Abraham Lincoln announced slavery had ended in the United States.
And we should remember this important date, June 19, 1865, represents the evolution of our country to a more perfect union. We were not perfect in 1528, 1619, 1776, 1865. or even a day in 2021, but we're moving hopefully to a more perfect union.
Juneteenth is directly related to the history of the Civil War and the emancipation of enslaved people in the Confederacy. Juneteenth is important for Texas because that is when enslaved Texans learned they were free and that the Confederacy had fallen.
So we're standing in the 2200 block of the Strand Historic District in Galveston. This was the heart of the commercial district, and at one time,
Was the largest city in Texas.
the largest enslaver also lived here in Galveston. They owned 7 plantations, 4 in Brazoria County, 2 in Matagorda County, and 1 in Fort Bend.
Texas was this safe haven for slavery. They did what they called the running of the slaves. That was basically moving their slaves to Texas because there was no Union presence in Texas.
When Lincoln issued the Emancipation Proclamation, he knew that that would not immediately end slavery, and it didn't. And the reason is fairly simple. The Confederate States of America had formed its own country. They elected their own president. Confederate states printed their own money, which is why the Confederacy and the United States went to war. The United States' goal at the beginning of the war was just to restore the Union. The first war goal was not to emancipate the enslaved population.
And there were all these myths and stories about what happened and why it took 2.5 years for the word to reach Texas. Plantation owners in Texas were well aware of the Emancipation Proclamation, but they ignored it. What they cared about was maintaining the agrarian economy in Texas, and that was solidly based on cotton. And to maintain that, they needed slave labor. General Gordon Granger was on his way to Texas. Most of the Texas authorities had a pretty good idea what he was coming to Texas to do. Granger was in Texas for about a month. He sent his troops,
There were white soldiers and black soldiers.
plantation to plantation, making the announcement.
Those Black soldiers are people who especially helped shift the Union war goals from a war to restore the Union into a war of emancipation. It was personal for them.
They went over to the old Custom House on 20th Street to the Courthouse Square, from the Courthouse Square to the Colored Church on Broadway, which was Reedy Chapel.
Some of the dock workers were among the first to get the word, and so the celebrations began.
Give us a sense of what it must have been like for slaves on Juneteenth when they heard that message.
You know, that was something that was almost like going to heaven.
The celebrations, just to be so excited to taste that freedom.
The initial celebrations, there would be prayer services, looking back at our journey to this country and what we had to endure in bondage. And the people who never lived to see that day. I think it's inescapable not to remember those people. Transatlantic voyage, the Middle Passage, people jumping off ships to avoid the treatment that they would have to endure.
Marshall didn't tell you no, it was free.
He didn't tell you that?
No, he didn't tell you. I think now they said it wait till 6 months out of there. 6 months. And turn them loose on the 19th of June. That's why you know we celebrate that day. Colorful. Celebrate that day.
One of the quotes that I'm most fond of is from a former slave named Felix Haywood. Slavery could make you free, but it couldn't make you rich, because a lot of slaves thought that now that they were free, they would be rich, just like the white man.
You think about the elation, the trepidation of enslaved people, not knowing what the future holds and being enslaved and bondage being lifted from their backs.
And there was one narrative about one slave who got the word, and his sister said, brother gave a whoop and ran away, and I never saw him again.
Was the South ready to free slaves? No, we know that.
Even though the order indicated the enslaved were free, if you look at the last sentence, it gives some instructions of what they can or cannot do.
The freedmen are advised to remain quietly at their present homes and work for wages. They are informed that they will not be allowed to collect at military posts and that they will not be supported in idleness either there or elsewhere.
You're told you're free, you're thinking that, oh, I can live my life. But it wasn't like that.
On one hand, you were free by name, but the actual reality of freedom, you were not fully experiencing it.
There were a lot of very frightened former slaves, and a lot of them stayed on the plantation.
They laid the bricks in the downtown area here where we stand on many of these buildings. Not only laid the bricks, but made the bricks.
Just off Galveston's bustling Broadway Street is Ashton Villa, built in 1859 by James Monroe Brown, a loyalist to the Confederacy, dubbed an honorary colonel. Brown was also a wealthy banker, architect, and mason who designed what's believed to be Texas' first all-brick house, a palace with bricks all laid by slaves.
Anywhere you read, they will tell you that, slaves did all the work for this. They had to follow what the contractor was either telling them or showing them in order to do it. And look at this place. It's beautiful.
All of the intricacies and the detail that still stand today. It's amazing.
1859, one of the few buildings that withstood the 1900 storm.
Ashton Villa was saved from demolition in 1970. The historic home, now an event space, is operated by the Galveston Historical Foundation and home to the island's annual Juneteenth celebration.
They could leave the farm, they could leave the plantation, and they did, because so many emancipated people no longer wanted to work in agriculture because it reminded them of enslavement. For many people, the draw was labor, the opportunity to earn wages.
Working to pay off debt. The debts were never paid off. There were a lot of things that still kept the free people
Suppressed.
suppressed. That's why a group of them ended up in your hometown in Houston. So they marched to Houston.
The Black population of Houston boomed. They began to build homes in the part of Houston known as Fourth Ward. Houston was divided into 6 different wards at the time. And so the land in that area of Fourth Ward happened to be very low and flood prone. It wasn't land that was coveted by white Houstonians at the time.
When you look at the bricks of Freedmanstown, that brick is a symbol of foundation. That brick was a symbol of hope. The brick was theirs. They made the brick, they formed the brick, shaped the brick, they laid the brick. They stood on the brick.
Iconic housing of Freedmanstown was the shotgun house. There was a door in the front and then a door in the back. And people would joke that if you shot a gun, the bullet would travel all the way through without hitting anything.
The legendary Jack Yates, this
is the land where he lived, and right next door to him was his son, the printer Rutherford B.H. Yates. The first time I walked along these bricks, I was very emotional. This is where my people decided that they would survive. These are 8-pound bricks that were double baked. And the significance of these bricks is that it has that beautiful red color of the clay that was here. And the fact that they are still here today is a testament to their strength, a testament to their craftsmanship and their skill.
Oh, these are original. I reside here in Freedmanstown. I was born in Freedmanstown, probably conceived in Freedmanstown. And this is a home that has been passed down through our family. I'm like the 5th generation. And the family operated a ice business and just drove through the community selling blocks of ice.
Did their best to gain property and to support their communities.
The wards in Houston functioned a little bit like small towns. Third Ward develops a Black community. Fifth Ward develops one early. The Black community of Third Ward begins to develop around what we today call Emancipation Avenue, but that back then was Dowling Street, which was actually the name of a Confederate. Dowling is really the center of old Black Third Ward. And one of the reasons for that is the creation or the purchase of Emancipation Park. And it's the first public space owned by Black people in the state of Texas.
With newfound freedom came new challenges, including the fight to be seen as equal.
Freed men and women did more than survive. They built a legacy.
And it is right here, Emancipation Park.
In Houston's historic Third Ward.
Emancipation Park was always a place to celebrate.
2 Black church congregations fundraised to buy the park. For them, the memory of Juneteenth would have been very fresh. They were someone else's property less than a decade earlier.
I'm the great-great-granddaughter of Jack Yates. He was instrumental in purchasing Emancipation Park, where the free slaves celebrated Juneteenth.
One of the most famous families in Reconstruction era Houston were the Yates family.
He was free. However, his wife and children weren't. So he came to Texas and entered back into slavery so that he could be with his family.
They were brought here to continue to be slaves.
Once freedom came again, he knew what that tasted like. He knew what that felt like. So he took his family and moved to Houston to start a brand new life.
Jack Yates actually began helping and teaching and helping them to learn, because at that time, slaves weren't supposed to read or write.
He was a wage laborer as his day job, and at night preached near the Buffalo Bayou in Houston. And then gradually they were able to build their own church.
Antioch Missionary Baptist Church, and have been all of my life. That was the first church that he started, but there were many other churches that he started, including Bethel in Houston.
It is that spirit, it is that zeal, it is that determination that he and others poured into the foundations when they built this church. So when you talk about World War I, our soldiers went off to fight. When they came home, Antioch was able to train and cross-train ex-veterans in masonry work, in carpentry work, and really help these ex-soldiers to find jobs and to provide homes for their families, education for their children. It was these very women from this very church who taught other women how to vote.
So many great people have been here and have been inspiring and galvanizing the community.
When I was growing up in Houston, I knew the name Yates because it was the name of a high school, Jack Yates High School in Third Ward, the first Black school in Houston. For a while had just been called Houston Colored High School. As the Black community spreads and grows in other parts of the city, you need more schools. So when a second high school is established in Houston in Third Ward, it's named after Jack Yates.
All right, so that was a lot to cover in the first portion of our first video. We're going to pause now for reflection before we start. We'll reconnect with that video a little bit further. And again, I will put the link if you want to view the entire video in the chat. So the floor is open, same rules as always. Either throw a question mark in the chat so I can call on you to unmute, or you can place your comment in the chat.
Amy,
Yep.
I'll make a comment. I struggle a bit with your initial statement of let us celebrate June 19th because there was so much wrong with it. And the fact that there was, or the plan was to have no plan. You couldn't gather at the Army posts. You had to, negotiate your workers or your wages. You were going to enter into collective bargaining, and you basically couldn't travel without written permission of white authorities. So the plan was a plan of oppression to continue slavery by another name. So I want to recognize June 19th, all the history of it and everything else that has been raised in it. But at the same time, I am, kind of, I'll use the word disgusted that the notion that we had thought things through and were providing a path for emancipation. It was a continuation of a lot of brutality. I have read some accounts of slave owners who, rather than release the slave owners, chose to kill them. Just the horror terror of it all, and the mixed frustrations and expectations are disturbing. That's all.
No, Steve, one, I love to be challenged, so thank you. And two, I appreciate you for a lot of reasons, and that comment is now one of them. And I'm just speaking as one Black woman. If Black folks waited until things were perfect before we chose to celebrate, we would never celebrate. So, and I agree.
I hear you.
Yeah.
I hear you.
And I agree with everything you just said. The plan was not to have a plan. But if you recall back in the beginning of the video, the point of the Civil War wasn't to emancipate enslaved people. It was to restore the Union. So I think it was very clear from the beginning what the plan was, and the strategy may have shifted to achieve that. But I don't have the luxury of operating under the delusion that the Civil War was fought to emancipate enslaved persons. Yes, but thank you for those comments. Anyone else before we move forward in the video? All right, well, we have a lot to get to, so we will jump back in.
Some of the early Juneteenth celebrations were marked by pageantry, flowers, and people riding in these very elaborate coach setups.
Regional and local Black newspapers celebrating the day. You'll see announcements about picnics that are related to the holiday.
A lot of people for those celebrations dressed up in their Sunday best. They would just be joyful. There would be parties, church services, in a lot of the communities, whites didn't want to recognize those celebrations. If some of those former slaves had jobs, they couldn't get the day off to celebrate. A lot of the city officials said, well, you can't have your celebration in the city. And so that would push those celebrations out, away from the city in rural settings and pastures, meadows, groves, wherever. They went with the flow.
I guess my earliest memories of celebrating Juneteenth would be when I was a child. Juneteenth was always a big celebration in our community.
Eventually, you'll see the establishment of parades. We know in Houston, we do have a couple of parades. In fact, Juneteenth Queen and King.
Family get-togethers, community get-togethers. You would have barbecue, watermelon,
Ribs and hot sausage.
red soda pop. Those were the staples. You had to have all of that on Juneteenth. You must have that barbecue.
In recent years, Juneteenth celebrations continue to include parades and music, but most importantly, a focus on the food. And one restaurant that continues to provide Juneteenth meals, even amidst the pandemic, is Lucille's.
Feeding all the people they can, this fine dining Houston establishment, home to a culinary artist carrying on the family's legacy of African-American excellence in gastronomy. Beautiful. This Museum District restaurant is Lucille's. It is where the past meets the present on a plate. Restaurant itself is named after owner and executive chef Chris Williams' great-grandmother, Lucille B. Smith.
Often noted as Texas's first African-American businesswoman. She created the first instant hot roll mix in the history of this country, which is a recipe that Pillsbury borrowed to create their empire. This is verified by the Chicago Tribune in 2014. She was the first national African-American food editor for Sepia Magazine, which is now Ebony Magazine. Her client list included everybody from LBJ to the Roosevelts, Martin Luther King, to Muhammad Ali, to Joe Louis, all points in between.
Chef Williams continues the family legacy, having hosted President Biden. But it is not just the powerful for whom he hosts or prepares food for.
So we provide service to all the historically Black neighborhoods, from Sunnyside, the 3rd Ward, the 5th Ward, the Acres Homes.
Having founded the nonprofit Lucille's 1913, the year his great-grandmother birthed her catering business, and also the same year marking the 50th anniversary of the Emancipation Proclamation.
At our peak, we were doing 1,800 meals a day.
So I had a pork shoulder that I braised for about 4 hours.
Allows them to play with a ton of different ingredients.
This Juneteenth, he'll prepare more meals.
The barbecue chicken, the beans.
On top of the already 250,000 meals served.
And that's what we're working on right now for the menu for today. Getting ready to feed the people of Houston.
Delivering dignity and preserving history.
The restaurant does pay homage to her culinary freedom and creativity as a chef.
With fresh, elevated food.
It's exactly what we do over today at Lucille's. It's Southern cuisine with global influences.
Word Reconstruction sounds good, and it started out well-intentioned, but it didn't stay, quote unquote, Reconstruction, did it?
No. When we think about the period of Reconstruction, particularly here in Texas, we always have to think about the turmoil around politics.
The Democratic Party was conservative. The Republican Party was liberal. 1870 15th Amendment is what makes Black men's right to vote constitutional. And this changes the political landscape of parts of the South that had large Black populations. Black men start voting other Black men into office. Some places had Black sheriffs. So this immediately changes the politics of the South. So the Ku Klux Klan arises as the violent wing of the Democratic Party.
We're familiar with the KKK, but there were a number of white vigilante groups that existed during this time that terrorized African Americans.
By the early 1900s, the Black community had already established itself with neighborhoods, businesses, and schools, but Blacks still weren't considered as equal. With segregation and Jim Crow laws, they were still being treated like second-class citizens.
Segregation laws restricted every public space where Southerners could possibly make contact. When we say Jim Crow law, we are referring to legal segregation. Boston creates segregation laws in order to separate Black and white passengers on city streetcars in the 1840s. People in Boston started to refer to the Black section of streetcars as the Jim Crow section. They did that because Jim Crow referred to a popular minstrel figure. Early on, it was white performers, typically white men, who would blacken their faces using burnt cork, but Jim Crow was the most popular blackface minstrel character. So popular that many white people in the United States began to identify the name Jim Crow with Black people.
Here in Houston, you really can't think about Jim Crow laws without thinking about the 24th Infantry, African-American soldiers who found themselves here at Camp Logan and found themselves the victims of police brutality and Jim Crow laws and segregation.
Right, you're absolutely right. In the summer of 1917, the United States enters World War I. The U.S. military was still segregated. The military was constructing a training facility called Camp Logan.
So when these 700 white soldiers show up in Houston, Jim Crow is alive and well. And you got to remember, it's a new thing. And these soldiers had fought in the Spanish-American War, in North San Juan Hill, had fought in the Philippines. They weren't used to being treated as second-class citizens.
It all came to a head that August when Houston police officers were accused of attacking and killing one of the soldiers. Black soldiers of Camp Logan then marched from what's now Memorial Park to the city of Houston.
This was a push against Jim Crow authority.
Mutiny and rioting ensued.
It was a strike against police brutality.
16 white people were killed, mostly civilians. 4 Black soldiers died. The deadly encounter led to the soldiers' court-martial, the largest murder trial in U.S. history.
I saw the photograph of the trial. That blew my mind. Here are these 63 Black soldiers surrounded by white soldiers with fixed bayonets on their rifles. And caption said the largest murder trial in American history. And I had never heard anything.
In the end, 19 soldiers were hanged and all but 8 of 118 soldiers charged were convicted for their part in the Houston riot of 1917.
All right. So that was the second portion from the video. Any questions or comments? And while we're waiting, I'll drop that link in the chat. All right. We will move on to our second video, which is Rare Audio of Enslaved People. I will put that in the chat now for you.
It's a voice rarely heard, the voice of a formerly enslaved person. Few know that in the decades following emancipation, interviews were done in an effort to preserve their stories. And in tonight's Prime Focus, you'll hear some of what they said as part of our partnership with the 10 Million Names Project. ABC's Alex Brochet brings us their stories in their words.
I want you to tell me how you got your name. I got my name from President Jeff Davis. President of the Southern Confederation. He owned my grandfather and my father. My grandfather was a blacksmith, and my father had learned how to write a little bit in Richmond, Virginia before he brought him down here.
You're listening to the voice of a formerly enslaved American, a man by the name of George Johnson. This rare and historic audio interview was recorded in 1941, almost 80 years after Mr. Johnson gained his freedom. He and his family worked on a plantation in Virginia owned by Confederate leader Jefferson Davis, a staunch opponent of abolition. In the interview, Johnson recalls a day in the life as an enslaved person.
Did they drive the slaves down there in Davis' Bend very hard, or did they work them reasonable. Reasonable. You know, Martin Luther give much as another boy. And was chopping cotton. Boy didn't chip with the gang, you understand? He come to boy chip, you understand? That's how to march your boy. Yeah, that's what it's trouble, son. Say, Mr. Long hook me, probably chip with the gang.
Audio tape interviews like this are striking and uncommon, but are actually part of a long legacy of Black families, communities, and institutions, including historically Black colleges and universities, that lead the way in collecting and preserving the oral histories of the formerly enslaved people in the 19th and 20th centuries. In the 1930s and beyond, technology allowed some of these interviews to be recorded as part of both federal and independent projects. The details are often difficult to hear, but they remind us this history happened not too long ago, with names, faces, and stories. Do we know roughly how many of these recordings exist?
The recordings are relatively rare, but the recordings come from a much larger and really important and in many ways unsung collecting effort that took place. In terms of audio technology, most of it was not recorded by audio because the technology didn't exist, at least in any kind of widespread accessible way when most of those were conducted. So it's really just a handful of audio recordings we have.
In 1974, a woman named Celia Black, at the age of 114 years old and shortly before her death, recalled picking cotton in Texas as a child born into slavery.
I didn't have to pick cotton or nothing. I didn't do nothing but work in the field. Worked in the field, oh goodness. Made my husband go out west and pick cotton. Go out west every year. We've been this year going out there picking cotton.
One of the things that kind of struck me when you have an interview recorded in 1974, for some Black Americans, I mean, they're one generation removed from slavery.
In some ways, we think of slavery as ancient history. We think of it as something that happened a very long time ago to people we couldn't possibly have known. I was 6, 7 years old in 1974. So it's kind of amazing that we were alive at the same time. I was alive at the same time who was someone who had been born enslaved.
Alex Haley's Roots premiered on ABC just 3 years after this interview with Celia Black.
What's your name?
Kunta Kinte.
Alex Haley came into his work, Roots, what became Roots really, through his grandmother's stories. So we're really talking about oftentimes great-grandparents at this point in the 70s.
Dr. Kendra Field, chief historian of the 10 Million Names Project, and Harvard professor Vincent Brown explained how these recordings illustrate an enormous preservation effort, the firsthand accounts shedding light on the darkest chapters in our American history, yet also revealing incredible African-American strength and survival.
Didn't you have some entertainment doing a dancing or anything? Oh, I used to dance, but I don't do it now. No, I don't dance now. I try my best to serve my master. I'm trying my best to serve my heavenly Father.
You hear these recordings. What were the emotions when you hear, the recollections of a Celia Black?
First is just the miracle of her survival. It's just that I'm actually hearing this person who had been enslaved. That's kind of a miracle.
Celia Black was alive when Abraham Lincoln was president and lived to see the resignation of President Richard Nixon.
Oh, man. You remember Abraham Lincoln? President? Oh, well, they gave him a good name. Oh, Abraham Lincoln. They thought Abraham was they thought everybody thought Abraham was the best president in the world.
In a similar effort to preserve this history and legacy, the 10 Million Names Project is a moonshot endeavor that aims to use the power of ancestry research to identify the names of the 10 million men, women, and children who were enslaved in the territory that became the United States. The goal is to put names and faces on this vital history, not only to give the enslaved the dignity they deserve, but to connect those living today with their family story. With the help of the 10 Million Names genealogist, we were able to find the direct descendants of Celia Black.
Yeah.
In Rhode Island, we met 68-year-old Curtis Royal, who spent time with her as a young man.
She's my great grandmother from my mother's side of the family.
Do you remember any of the stories that she would tell?
She told us about how difficult it was, just being alive during that period. And of course, she would tell us a story about the big ox that they had. They had two of them, and how her father would set her right on the head of the ox, and she would just hold on with the horns. So those are, as a boy, those are fascinating. You say, wow.
My grandfather had some big old oxen. He had one that big with wide horns. One looked like a house. Wide horns. And I used to sit up there and train them horns. And then his name was Coley. And the other one was named Left.
Was it ever difficult to talk about slavery?
Yes, and I think what made it so difficult is it just realizing, how emotional it was and what they went through. You try to put yourself in their physical being and to understand what they went through, and it is scary.
You've heard the recording
Yes.
of your great grandmother
Yes.
in 1974.
It was very challenging for me to hear when they asked her the question about what it was like working in the fields, the heat in Texas, the humidity, and sometimes 105, 110 degrees, and I just can't fathom waking up sun up to sundown working in the fields. How did they do it? How did they do it?
You learn about slavery in America. I think especially being a Black American, the initial emotion is anger.
There's the history of slavery as an institution, which was all about oppressing people. And that's a very dark history that I think should make us angry. But then there's an African American history of survival through and beyond that institution. And that's kind of amazing. To hear people, accepting that I lived this life, it was incredibly hard, and I'm still here, and that I've survived, and I've got children, and I've passed on some kind of legacy.
How does who's conducting these interviews and how they're conducting these interviews, how does that matter?
So, I mean, it's enormously important. For the WPA interviews in general, the vast majority are white interviewers. Some are the children of the former slave owners, in fact, that are interviewing a former slave of that same family.
But everywhere, slavery was a system for allocating status. And slaves and ex-slaves were supposed to be low status people. And so when they were talking to people who they perceived to be of higher status, they had to be very careful about what they said, right? Because those people could determine their fate.
While many of the audio recordings don't reflect it, slaves were frequently subjected to heinous forms of abuse, including beatings, sexual assault, and forms of torture. The historic 10 Million Names Project, in which ABC News is the exclusive media partner, is an ancestry database that the public can access, add information to, and use as a research tool. And because so little information about enslaved people was officially documented, amassing this data is a huge task.
We encourage anyone that wants to get involved to reach out, to go to the website and to be part of that project.
Who stands the most to gain from hearing these? I mean, is it Black folk? Is it younger Black folk? Is it white America? Is it Americans as a whole?
If we're going to understand anything about freedom, we're going to have to understand the people who were denied that freedom. I mean,
While very few of us will have the opportunity of hearing our ancestors' voices on tape, the 10 Million Names Project hopes that one day all Black Americans will have the chance to know their ancestors' names and stories the way that Curtis knows Celia. You had the chance to know your great-grandmother.
Yes.
How powerful is it being able to connect that dot?
It's extremely powerful. You got to hear it from her directly, not something that was passed on, but to hear it directly from her pain.
Our thanks to
So, with watching that video and being able to hear the voices of formerly enslaved people, I appreciate the emphasis that they put on what you are hearing. Not so much under duress, but the persons that were speaking were probably very careful about the information that they were sharing. So keep that in mind as you reflect on the commentary that was in those videos. Any comments or anything that resonated that you would like to share with the group? Go ahead and throw a question mark in the chat so I can ask you to unmute, or you can share your comment in the chat. And while that's happening, the 10 Million Names Project, if anyone is interested in more information on that, I do have that website, so I'll put that in the chat.
Amy?
Yep, go ahead, Jean.
I appreciated Steve's comment earlier about celebration. And from a white perspective, it's just so difficult to, I guess, knowing more of the history, both before and after, it's just so difficult to have your eyes open like that. I really appreciated when the one gentleman that was interviewing talked about the strength and the courage of the people that he talked with. And wow, I mean, I've always just been so amazed that more anger didn't come out, because I think I would have felt very angry about the whole situation. So I have a lot of pride and respect. I have a lot of respect for African Americans, and the miracle of survival. I've never thought of it that way, but that really impacted me. The miracle of survival. And these people came through so much.
No, thank you for sharing that, Jean. And I believe it was in the first video we watched. And it wasn't that people weren't aware, and that's enslavers and enslaved people, about the Emancipation Proclamation, but it could not be enforced in parts of Texas unless the Union had a foothold in that area. So that was the delay of the 2.5 years. But once that happened and then Union moved in to Galveston and other parts of Texas, some of the slave owners shot the enslaved people. And I'm sure that speaks to the anger that you are referencing, because they probably had a sense that their lives were in danger. So there's that. Any other comments or reflections before we move on?
Yeah, and the anger I was talking about was anger on the African Americans' part. Not the fear and the anger of the white people, but just that whole dynamic. So, thanks, Amy.
No, absolutely. All right, our next video is why all Americans should honor Juneteenth.
Juneteenth is a deeply emotional moment for enslaved people, because for decades, for centuries, enslaved people prayed for, hoped for, fought for in the form of slave rebellions, running away, bought their freedom when they could. And if you read slave narratives, if you listen to spirituals from the era of slavery, you know that enslaved people longed for freedom. The
This was something that had been hoped for, but many believe may never come.
Promise to give me $40 a month in cash. You know, so the boy said they ain't want it. You gotta go free.
Being able to go wherever they wanted, being able to wonder about. For enslaved people, it was an expression of their freedom.
Well, that photo was the one that long miss photo, one of our white folks made them. We come along, we all sitting on the fence, and the colored children come along and asked her if she wanted to go with them. She said, yeah, she might run them horses. He went on with them. I never did see her, and he tell her no more.
When I think about Juneteenth, I think about it in the context of Emancipation Day celebrations that began January 1, 1863. They took on a whole new meaning when slavery was formally abolished after 1865. You would have had African American veterans who fought in the Civil War be prominent in these celebrations, dressed in their military garb, speeches from enslaved people, the most prominent Black politicians singing of hymns, spirituals, discussions of registering to vote. Enslaved people celebrating in public their newfound freedom was an act of resistance. Because we have to remember, slavery came to an end after a 4 years bloody Civil War. Still the bloodiest conflict in American history. Many people in the South and in the nation who did not want to see slavery abolished fought tooth and nail to block the 13th Amendment. The abolition of slavery created a huge humanitarian crisis in the South. Suddenly, 4 million people have very little means to take care of themselves, to support themselves, and do so in a really hostile environment. So the military was necessary to make sure that enslaved people got the food, the medicine, the shelter that they needed in order to survive. They're also there to protect, to the extent that that was possible, freed people from violence, from recriminations, from slaveholders, from Confederates who still hadn't given up the fight.
And I remember when the Yankees stuck here, and the Yankees stuck right on the corner of the line, and the first people knew, you go to the Grand Team, and the chicken hanging over the sun. That's the punishment they got. Next time in chief, they come on full supermarket, all riding horses. Burning, hang on. I said, Mama, where are they going? They're all going home now.
When the last federal troops leave the South, it's a signal to Southerners. The federal government wasn't going to put its might into ensuring civil rights of Black people would be observed. You have 20, 30 years later, Black people being lynched in public, and there isn't a federal anti-lynching law to protect them. In most communities in America, there's a history of lynching and racial violence, and very few communities have marked that, commemorated that. Every decade since the end of slavery, Black people have been more educated, accrued more wealth, more status in American society. Every decade since 1865. But there's been one constant, and that constant is the presence of random racist violence. What I see in George Floyd's murder was a white police officer attempting to dominate and to subdue a black man who was not resisting, who could not resist. Even though slavery came to an end in 1865, the desire to master and dominate black bodies did not. And we have never dealt with that. These are the kind of stark realities that are highlighted during Juneteenth. If Black people's lives can be expunged through racist violence and no one is held accountable, how free are we? Are we free?
All right. Same rules apply. Any comments, anything that resonated that you would like to share from that video? All right. I have one more video lined up for us. It is James Earl Jones reading Frederick Douglass's speech, "What to the Slave is the 4th of July," which I think is a beautiful segue, because then we will spend our last 30 minutes together, or however much time is needed until 7, to discuss how we in this call keep the spirit of Juneteenth alive in words and deed throughout the entire year. So we'll watch one final video and then I will open the floor for our discussion.
Today in this special broadcast, we begin with the words of Frederick Douglass. Born into slavery around 1818, Douglass became a key leader of the abolitionist movement. On July 5th, 1852, in Rochester, New York, Frederick Douglass gave one of his most famous speeches, "What to the Slave is Your 4th of July." He was addressing the Rochester Ladies Anti-Slavery Society. This is James Earl Jones reading the historic address during a performance of Voices of a People's History of the United States. It was co-edited by Howard Zinn. The late great historian introduced the address.
Frederick Douglass, once a slave, became a brilliant and powerful leader of the anti-slavery movement. In 1852, he was asked to speak in celebration of the 4th of July.
Fellow citizens, pardon me, and allow me to ask, why am I called upon to speak here today? What have I, or those I represent, to do with your national independence? Are the great principles of political freedom and of natural justice embodied in that Declaration of Independence extended to us? And am I therefore called upon to bring our humble offering to the national altar and to confess the benefits and express devout gratitude for the blessings resulting from your independence to us? I am not included within the pale of this glorious anniversary. Your high independence only reveals the immeasurable distance between us. The blessings in which you this day rejoice are not enjoyed in common. The rich inheritance of justice, liberty, prosperity, and independence bequeathed by your fathers is shared by you, not by me. The sunlight that brought life and healing to you has brought stripes and death to me. This 4th of July is yours, not mine. You may rejoice, I must mourn. To drag a man in fetters into the grand illuminated temple of liberty and call upon him to join you in joyous anthems were inhuman mockery and sacrilegious irony. Do you mean, citizens, to mock me by asking me to speak today? What to the American slave is your 4th of July? I answer, a day that reveals to him more than all other days of the year the gross injustice and cruelty to which he is a constant victim. To him, your celebration is a sham. Your boasted liberty, an unholy license. Your national greatness, swelling vanity. Your sounds of rejoicing are empty and heartless. Your denunciation of tyrants, brass-fronted impudence. Your shouts of liberty and equality, hollow mockery. Your prayers and hymns, your sermons and thanksgivings, with all your religious parade and solemnity, are to him mere bombast, fraud, deception, impiety, and hypocrisy. A thin veil to cover up crimes that would disgrace a nation of savages. There's not a nation of the earth guilty of practices more shocking and bloody than are the people of these United States at this very hour. At a time like this, scorching irony, not convincing argument, is needed. Oh, had I the ability and could reach the nation's ear, I would today pour forth a stream, a fiery stream of biting ridicule, blasting reproach, withering sarcasm, and stern rebuke. For it is not light that is needed, but fire. It is not the gentle shower, but thunder. We need the storm, the whirlwind, the earthquake. The feeling of the nation must be quickened. The conscience of the nation must be roused. The propriety of the nation must be startled. The hypocrisy of the nation must be exposed, and the crimes against God and man must be proclaimed and denounced.
James Earl.
All right, so that is where we will leave our video segments for this evening. It's 6:33, so we're a few minutes early or over, but the floor is open. How do we on this call celebrate Juneteenth? And more importantly, how do we carry the spirit of Juneteenth throughout the year in not just our words, not just showing up at events, but in our deeds? So I'm going to stop talking and the floor is open. Throw a question mark in the chat if you want to be asked to unmute. All right. If no one is interested in sharing, Neil, the floor is yours and you can go ahead and open the parking lot. I will end the recording.